Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerStrategy.com, and I'm here today going over the first part of one of the Poker Strategy members' hand histories. This is from a $200 heads-up tournament on PokerStars that I believe we got pretty deep in. So I'm going to go through this relatively fast, but if I see any interesting hands, I will certainly point them out. Alright, heads up, from the small blind, I would certainly be raising a decent amount of hands. Right off the bat, I see that our play it's a very, very close spot. Here you're raising a continuation bet again. This time you elect to give up, and your opponent had middle pair, so that's certainly worth noting. Here you 3-bet your opponent. I would generally 3-bet a little bit less, probably to about 150. You definitely want to get called here, especially when you have queens and your opponent doesn't really know how large your 3-bet size is going to be on average. So I'd probably 3-bet just a little bit smaller. Pretty atrocious board. You bet 160, which I think is fine. Notice pre-flop you made it 170, so you're betting a little bit less than half pot here. And I think there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. So I like the bet, and if you get raised, you should probably get out of the way. Jack's a very bad card. I would check, so you check as well. Ace is a pretty good card on the river. I don't really think you can value bet here, though. I don't think there's too much you can get called with that you're ahead of. And your opponent did have King 10, so that was fantastic. I would fold hands like 7-3 basically every time. And I would raise hands like 6-4 basically every time. Whenever you get down a little bit at the beginning of a heads-up match, don't get upset or flustered. I'll see a lot of players that will lose like 1,200 chips in the first few hands, and they'll just go nuts trying to win it back, and they just end up busting themselves more often than not. So it seemed like you handled yourself well in your first few hands where you got down a little bit. So that's very good. Good to see you handling it well. Here you call a raise with King 9. I think this is fine. I would check raise this board, but I think your check raise is just a little bit too big. Again, you definitely want to get called here, and your opponent doesn't know anything about your tendencies. So I'd check raise to 140 here and then bet like 260 on the turn. It seems like you play a pretty good, solid game from what I can tell so far, though. I would have certainly continuation bet this board. Your opponent doesn't seem to be floating or anything like that too often. The only time we've seen his hand, I think he had middle pair. So given that he's check calling with hands, this is a great board to bet at. And when your opponent bets a turn, you of course have to fold, and that's not really what you want to happen. Jack 10 suited is an okay hand to 3-bet with if you haven't 3-bet in a while, but since you have been 3-betting, I think calling... Uh-oh. My iPad's not working. Since you haven't 3-bet in a while, I think... Or since you just 3-bet, I think calling is probably best, because it is going to flop very well. I would check raise here again. Again, I'd probably make it just a touch smaller. Actually, seeing that you've made it large like 3 times now, and he has folded every time, I'd probably make it the same 180 size. But in general, I think you'd want to make it just a little bit smaller. King's a terrible turn, but on this river, I would say you have to value bet. you have the best hand basically every time. It is going to check a lot if you check. And if your opponent bets, it's never really the best spot in the world. If you bet, though, I don't think this guy's ever just going to like jam it in as a bluff. You may value town yourself sometimes if your opponent has king 10, king 9, or king jack. But more often than not, I think you have the best hand, and you'll get looked up by one pair here if you bet like 180. So you do bet 240, and that's a good bet. I think that's fine. I'd maybe bet just a little bit smaller, though. Because on that board, your opponent can really only have something like a middle pair, and you have to think about what you're trying to get value from. And it's going to be tough to get value there if you bet much larger than like 180 or 240. I think raising jack 6 is fine, but again, be careful raising hands like that. This guy seems to not play too incredibly well, though, so I think you can get away with it. All right, here you raise. This guy 3-bets. This is the second or third time he's 3-bet you just a little while ago. So I think jamming it all in here is fine, but I wouldn't be super happy about it. But I do think it's fine. You definitely need to make sure your opponent cannot just run you over whenever he feels like it. This is a pretty good spot to fire out another barrel, I think. If he checks here with a gut shot, I would go ahead and bet like 100. And I would bet this river as well. I think it's pretty unlikely your opponent has an ace. I mean, I guess he could have an ace. There's no reason for him not to have an ace. But if you bet the turn, I would also bet the river. You just end up 3-barreling here if you were in my shoes. And he does have the ace. I think you could probably get him off the ace on the turn, but it's tough to say. So I would have lost a pile of money there. With 9-8, I would definitely not fold. I would either 3-bet or call, and I'd probably 3-bet. Hands like this are really good to mix it up with. And, you haven't 3-bet in a few hands, so I'd go ahead and 3-bet it again. Just keep the pressure on him. 9-8's a little bit too good to fold, though. You check it back on this board. This is an okay board to check back on. You have the gut shot and the overcard, so and also it's a board that that's going to hit your opponent's range a decent amount of the time. So I don't really hate a check back. Obviously, you have to call the turn with a double gutter. When he checks the river, I don't think you're really going to get him to fold any pair here. And if he doesn't have a pair, you win. So I think checking back's probably good. All you can really get him off of here is a 7 if you bet. So you do check it back and you do win. So that's a good play. Here you make it 125 for some reason. Earlier you made it a little bit less than pot. You made it 170 when he made it 60. Now that he min raises, you're making it a little bit more. I'm not really a fan of this. I think I'd just make it like 100. This is a pretty good spot to just call. There aren't too many draws out, and I really don't see what he's going to call your shove with unless he has exactly like king, queen, or king, jack. So I would not shove here. I think this is actually the worst play, though. I would not make a small re-raise here. What this is going to do is it's just going to make him fold out a lot of decent made hands. And if he has a draw, like 7-8, you're giving him the right odds to draw to it now, so that's not what you want either. I think you either need to call and try to slow play and get him to bluff off, or you need to just shove and try to get him to call off with one of those kings that he's drawing very thin with. But I would really prefer the call in this spot. I think making it 288 here is a screaming strength. And sure enough, he does fold, and that's not what you want right here. I think you could have easily stacked this guy here if you just called, and instead you didn't win much of anything. This is an okay hand to 3-bet as well. Sometimes. When I say you should 3-bet these hands, I don't mean you should do it all the time, but you should certainly do it sometimes. All right, the blinds went up. He raised, and you can either jam or small 3-bet. I would probably just go for the small 3-bet here again. Obviously, you can't make it like 230 or anything like that, because then he's going to know that he doesn't have much fold equity. But I think I would make a small 3-bet here and then obviously call off. So I guess I feel like you're playing your big hands just a little bit too fast. At least that's what I get from this first game. I would for sure check the river, and I'd probably call a bet here with the Queen 10. So you played that one pretty well, I think. On this board, I would be betting basically every turn. I guess you got lucky that you got a 9, but it doesn't really matter. On a board like 7-5-4 and your opponent checks back the flop, you should be very happy betting the vast majority of the time. Here with the 7-6 suited, yeah, I guess you should probably just fold, seeing how short he is. If he had many more chips, though, like if he had 900, I'd be very tempted to call and take a flop. I'd probably, what would I do here? I think donking's fine, but I think going for a check raise is fine as well in a limp pot like that. It's kind of weird that he hasn't limped yet, though, so it kind of puts you in a tricky spot. Okay, so you raise pre-flop and you bet the flop. I would probably check back the turn here. And the reason I would do this is because if you bet twice, he's going to think you have a pretty big hand. It seems like you're playing relatively straight up so far, and your opponent's playing relatively straight up so far too. And if you bet twice here, he's going to fold out a lot of stuff. So I would check it back here on the turn. And as you see, he does fold the turn to the turn bet. I think if you check back the turn, he can easily fire on the river, and then you can call, and you can probably snap off a few more chips. But betting here, sometimes your opponent's going to have a better ace, and it's going to double him up. And when he has a weaker hand, he's just going to fold. So I think this is a spot where you should definitely check back the turn. You seem to have something for Jack X. I would just fold Jack 3 here, for sure, given how short he is. Alright, let's start this hand all the way over, because this is a pretty interesting one. Your opponent limps. I guess he was going to go for a limp shove here. It's kind of tough to say. But I think checking's fine. I think you could also shove pre-flop. I think your opponent's going to fold a lot of the time, and when he does call, you'll have a decent amount of equity. I think this donk here is okay. Your opponent's not going to have much on this board a lot of the time. But a lot of players will limp with hands like ace-x or small pairs to try to trap you, even though it's kind of a dumb play. So he's never folding to one barrel here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So you need to be prepared to fire multiple barrels if you are going to do this. So I'd bet like 30 and then bet maybe 90 here. But when you check the turn, you sort of give up, you know. I mean, it's clear you don't have a jack anymore. So there's not much you can really represent if you don't go ahead and fire again. This is a good board to check back. I have no problem with that. And I think folding's fine. Jamming is definitely good now that he gets this short. Once your opponent gets down to about 25 big blinds or less, if he raises pre-flop, shoving is usually a pretty good play. With the ace-4, I would probably just go ahead and continuation bet the flop with a gut shot. It's a pretty good hand. When your opponent checks the turn, I think betting is fine as well. I would jam here with the ace-5. This is kind of a similar spot as the king 10. Actually, knowing that he limps with hands like ace-5, I would be a little bit less prone to shove with ace-5, because if he's limping ace-5, he's probably also limping small pairs, probably like ace-8 and lower, stuff like that. And he's probably calling a shove with all those. So his limping range may be mostly a limp calling range, even though that range is going to be fairly weak. Ace-5 isn't going to do too good against that range. So I think checking definitely does have some merit in this situation. So a really good spot to continuation bet. He should not hit this board very often at all. This is another spot where I would check it back a lot of the time. In this spot, though, I think you should probably go ahead and bet. Given that you have the queen kicker, that's pretty strong. You're not too concerned with being behind here. So I think betting here is fine. If your opponent had less chips, though, I'd be a little bit more prone to check it back. But since he's up to 700, I would go ahead and bet again, because now you want to get his whole stack in, or at least try to get his whole stack in. And notice he is calling the flop a lot and then folding the turn. I'm not too sure what he's doing that with, but he seems to be doing it a decent amount. I would probably jam here with the king 7. It's not really going to flop very well, so you're probably better off just jamming it and trying to pick up the equity. Alright, here you 3-bet ace-9. I'm not too sure if you plan on calling a shove or not. With hands like ace-9, it's just a really tough spot if he shoves and you don't know anything about him. So I would actually consider just calling pre-flop here. Your opponent has a great reshove stack, and I guess you'd have to call if you shove, but it would not be a very happy situation. One thing you need to notice also is every time you've checked back so far, you've done it with the intention of giving up. And that's not necessarily good either. You need to check it back with some decent made hands from time to time, where hands like middle pair, like say you had Jack 10 here, you could check it back. And your opponent's bet basically every time you have checked it back. So be careful with that. You may be spewing a little bit of equity there as well. Guess I'd fold here. I'd consider ripping it in. Calling, I think, is okay. I don't really think any play is that terrible in this spot. The problem with calling is he's going to bet the flop a lot of the time and you're just going to miss. He checks, though, and that's really weird. I don't really know what to make of that. I would just give up here. I wouldn't be messing around. He probably has a queen. I would check fold the 5-3 here. And the reason I would check fold is because there are very few good turn cards for you besides a 2, 3, or 4, or 5. And your opponent could easily just continue betting, and it just puts you in a tricky spot. And this is exactly what you don't want to happen, so I would have just check folded the flop. Even though you do have a pair, it's just not a hand that's going to play very well. I would go for a check raise here. You like to check call, and I don't really like the check call here. I think you're better off raising and going ahead and putting the pressure on. By check calling, again, you're just going to let your opponent bet you off this hand later. So it seems like possibly a leak you have is that you play your hands relatively equal to their strength. And what I mean by that is with this ace-4, you're calling once with the intention of folding again if he bets. Same thing with the bottom pair, bottom kicker just a minute ago. Your hands like top pair, top kicker, you fire the flop, or bet the flop, then bet the turn, whereas with your weaker hands, you bet the flop, then check. So it seems like you're playing relatively straightforward, and a lot of good players will see right through that, and that's not going to be good in the future when you play against better opponents. So here you finally do decide to make a play, and I actually like this spot less than this one. Notice on this board there are less draws you could have. And because of that, there are less hands your opponent can have, and also he's going to give you more credit for a made hand. Here, there are a lot more draws, and because of that, your opponent could have something, and also he's going to put you more so on a draw than on a made hand, so he's not going to fold something like king 3 here ever. So I actually don't like this bluff. I would have liked the bluff earlier much better. Here you bet the turn. I mean, when you check raise the flop, I think betting the turn's fine, and you kind of get owned here. But I don't like that situation at all compared to the one you had just a few flops ago. This is a spot where I would consider firing again. There are a lot of hands you need to protect against, and you have a lot of equity, so I have no problem firing again on this spot. This is another spot I'd probably just check fold. Actually, pre-flop you could shove. Let's see what's going on. So it's only 80, so no, you can't really shove pre-flop. You could 3-bet this or call, but I would not really check call here too often. So it looks like you're going into call down mode here. and you do just call him all the way down, and you happen to be right. This is kind of interesting. I wouldn't really expect this guy to go off like this. He hasn't really shown any propensity to do this kind of thing, but you were right, so that's definitely good. I don't know. I don't make hero calls like this too often. I mean, I guess I do make hero calls like this, but I tend to not do it for all the chips, and you're basically doing it there for all the chips. Ace Jack suited, I'd certainly just jam it in here. And you win, so that's very good. First match, no problems. But yeah, I do think we picked up a few leaks you have where I think you're just playing a little bit too straightforward on average, so maybe mix it up a little bit more. And we'll go ahead and get right into this game. So the first few hands, not much is happening. This is kind of interesting. You have been min-raising this entire time. Obviously, this is a different game, so it doesn't really matter. But all of a sudden, you make it 50 here with the kings. I would never change it up when you have a monster. Even if your opponent's only seen you play like 3 hands, if your opponent thinks you're going to min-raise and then all of a sudden you change it up, they're going to be a little bit more scared. You could consider changing it up here with like air. I would have no problem with that. But I would certainly not change it up here with kings. I mean, it probably doesn't make much of a difference, but I would really hate for your opponent to fold like, king 8 or queen 8, something like that, because you make it 50 instead of 40. That would be a disaster. So just something to think about. I would basically never change it up there. Your 3-bet here is pretty big. He makes it 40. You make it 150. You seem to make it a little bit larger over min raises when you 3-bet, and I don't really think that's a problem. But if you're going to be 3-betting generally with your stronger hands, it's never really bad to keep it a little bit on the smaller side so that they'll call when they're dominated. So I don't particularly like this sizing. I'd make it make it 120, and I'd be perfectly fine with that. 10-5 offsuit, I would fold this. I'm staying at the Palms Casino right now, and people are yelling in the hotel room below me. Epic Poker League main event's tomorrow, the second one. So I'm looking forward to that. But I apologize if you can hear them yelling underneath me. Okay, let's start this hand over. I was distracted. Okay, you raise, he calls, the continuation bet. Pretty standard. Also, notice you're making it 40 here instead of 50. I guess you're doing this purely just based on board textures and things like that. I really just don't mix it up too often in spots like this. I just would bet my standard 40. On the river, he pounds it. Bets 3/4 pot. Well, I don't think there's too much you can beat here. Even though you do have the queen, I think your opponent's going to show up with an ace here a lot of the time. He could have something like a gut shot that missed on the flop, like 6-5. But I think that's pretty unlikely. So I think I would find a fold here. It'd be a reluctant fold, but I think I'd find a fold. And you found a fold as well, so I think that's good. I would 3-bet here with a 6-5. And I would probably continuation bet here with the 6s. Once you check back the flop, though, I like just checking it down. Again, here you're making it 45 as a continuation, but I don't really know why you're doing that. I guess it doesn't matter that much. As long as you're betting somewhere between like 40 and 60, it's not that big of a deal. But I would just always tend to keep it to the lower side and try to keep it mechanical so that your opponent can't get a read off your bet sizing. Here you decide to mix it up pretty nicely, though. You bet he check raises, and you go ahead and throw in the small 3-bet. I guess, well, first off, you're not risking much more to try to pick up this pot, and this does make your hand look like a very strong hand, even though it's sort of a line that wouldn't really be good to take with an ace here. I think this is fine. You're risking an extra 230 to win the pot, and I think that's perfectly fine, as long as you're not doing it too often. And also you could easily get your opponent off a queen here, which is certainly worth something. So I think this is an okay play. I wouldn't do this too often, but I think it's okay. I think calling or 3-betting with the queen 6 suited would be fine. I'd probably check raise this flop to try to get him off of hands like a 7. And also that gives you the lead in the hand, which is worth something. Pretty bad run out for you, but you still win. Here your opponent donks on the king 4. I'm usually a pretty big fan of attacking the donk bets, but right here, seeing that this is the first time he's done it, I think folding's fine. I think he's probably going to show up with a 4 here a lot of the time, but I'm not too sure he's going to be looking to fold it. Notice this guy's folding quite a bit from the small blind. It's a little bit different than your last opponent. And because of that, his range is generally going to be stronger pre-flop, so you should probably tend to 3-bet with weaker hands a little bit less and try to just do it with decently stronger hands. And also hands like king 9 are going to become a call versus a 3-bet to kind of mix it up, because there's not near as much value in it. I would probably throw out a bet here on the turn, because you do want to see a river here a lot of the time, and if you check, he can just take you off the hand. So right here, like say he has pocket 3s, if you check, he could bet and then just pick up the pot. Or, you know, if he has basically anything that's not paired, you'll pick up the pot, which is, you know, okay. I mean, you're just picking it up with the best hand, but I still think that's fine a lot of the time. So anyways, you fold. I would probably bet the turn there, though. Here you continuation bet, and he doesn't fold. You fire again on the turn. I can't say I'm a fan of this. I think when this guy check calls you on the flop, he's going to have something like king, queen, queen, jack, queen 10, or an ace, or a 5, or a flush draw. Obviously the flush draw got there, so he's not folding that. He's not going to fold an ace. He may fold a queen, but if he has a queen with a diamond, he's probably not going to fold that either. So if you're firing the turn here, you probably need to fire the river, but I think that's a little bit suicidal. So I would not fire again here on the turn. A diamond comes on the river. I would go ahead and fire again, try to get him off an ace. And he did have one of those hands that I thought he could have, like the queen with the queen of diamonds. So I mean, I think that line of betting the flop and then the turn, I think this is the turn bet kind of forces you into a river bet here a lot of the time. Because either you're trying to get him off an ace or a queen or a 5, or if a diamond comes, and if a non-diamond comes, you're trying to get him off of a queen. So either way, this is sort of ropes you into a 3-barrel, and you didn't. So I mean, I guess it's good that you didn't in this spot because you would have got looked up. But if the river was a 3 of clubs, I would still tell you to bet, and I think you probably would have got him off the queen. Anyways, I don't think the turn bet's good. I think you're better off just giving up. There are just too many hands your opponents can have there. Here he donks and you raise. This is a pretty good spot to raise. He could easily have any of these cards, and you could easily have an overpair. So I think raising's fine. And this is also good to know that his donks may be a weak play on average. I'd like a check call here with the flush draw and the king. When he fires again, I would sort of tilt his range towards an ace, or something like the queen of clubs or the jack of clubs. That being said, I still don't really think you can fold given your hand. And he actually had a set, so you were drawing thin, but that's fine. You know, you have equity when you call in those spots. Here's a spot where I would go ahead and 3-barrel. On the turn bet, I think I'd bet a little bit less. I mean, 165 isn't that much. I mean, it's like 60% pot, but I don't know. I always like betting a little bit smaller, especially if your opponents don't know what your turn bet sizing is on average. I know I say that I like to keep my bets basically the same, but when you have a monster and your opponents know nothing about your game, Like, for example, you haven't really bet too many turns in this game, so your opponent doesn't know what your turn bet size is. And when that's the case, you can just get away with varying your turn bet sizes, or your river bet sizes for that matter. But stuff like pre-flop that your opponents see every single hand, you really shouldn't be varying that too much. Like pre-flops and continuation bets, I wouldn't mix those up because it's very tough to balance, and it's just a very tough thing to do. I'd probably fire a bet here. You're not going to be able to continue on a lot of turns, so I would just fire out a bet there. If you're not going to be able to continue on turns if your opponent bets. What in the world is this? So he shoved a minute ago for about this many chips. I guess he had a little bit less that time. I would probably go ahead and jam it in here, but I wouldn't be very happy about it. I would not call pre-flop. I think calling even in position here is probably going to be like close to break even. I mean, if an ace comes, he can't be too happy. If a 9 comes, he can't be too happy. This is one of those spots where not much good can come from that situation. It's a pretty good check raise spot. Again, so I'm thinking these are pretty good check raise spots, and you seem to be more prone to just check call. The problem with check calling is you're going to be chopping the pot a lot of the time, if assuming your opponent checks it down, and when he doesn't check it down, you're just going to lose it on the turn anyway. So I would be more prone to check raise to try to get your opponent off a lot of different types of hands here. And sure enough, you chop it up, and I think if you check raise the flop, you're going to force him off this and all other hands besides the jack or a 7. I guess he'd continue with a flush draw as well. I wouldn't be too opposed to shoving here. He has been picking up the pace a little bit, but I think folding's fine as well. Again, I don't really like calling in this spot. He hasn't... I mean, when this guy's free betting just occasionally, you don't really want to call because he's going to have hands that dominate you quite often. If you jam here, notice you're going to get him to fold hands like Queen Jack, Queen 9, Queen 10, Ace 8, hands like that, hands that have you dominated. But when you just call, you're going to be playing these hands dominated a lot of the time. So by shoving, you force them off a lot of better hands. And by calling, you're just kind of setting yourself up to get stacked whenever you get a bad flop. So you decide to float. I really don't like this because your opponent's range is going to be like ace high or better here for the most part, and you can't do much against that. You got to bet the turn when he checks, but it's pretty gross. The problem with this turn is that you should not have a king too often, because when you call this flop, most opponents are going to put you on one of the pairs, like 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s. So when that king comes, if they have a king, they're going to check it to you, and you're going to bet, and then they're going to check shove every time. And if they have a lot of courage, they're going to check shove here a lot because you can't really have a king. So I don't like this bet. I think it's a little bit suicidal. I don't like that play at all. I don't like that whole hand. I would have just shoved or folded pre-flop. Okay, here you check it back with a hand that has some value. It's one of the first times we've seen you do this, but that's good. I like this. And then I would bet the turn, and I'd bet the river. Bad river. If this was anything besides an ace, 10, 9, or 8, I would bet the river. Here you check raise again. Again, notice you check raise relatively large, about 3 times his bet. And again, I'm just not a fan of this. I would make it 170. And, if you're not check raising very often, like I said, you really want to try to rope the guy in when you have him drawing stone dead. So the only times you seem to be check raising, for the most part, besides a few bluffs here and there, are when you have a very strong hand. And because of that, they can just make good folds every time you check raise. So you either need to check raise more or just stop check raising with your monsters. And you are going to lose some value by doing that, but it's going to make your life easier in the long run. So here, he raises, you 3-bet, with 10-4 suited. I have no problem with that. I think that's perfectly fine. I'd probably fold 10-5 pre-flop. King 7's another hand I would like to 3-bet, maybe to 200 or so. And you throw in a donk bet. I don't know. You haven't donked yet, so I think it's always a good time to go for it. I don't donk bet too much in my game, again, just because I think it's something that's really hard to balance for the most part. I've been given that as an excuse for a lot of things that I just don't do in my game. That's not necessarily a good excuse. Whenever you start playing like a really high level, like if you want to play $5,000 sit and goes, you're going to have to balance extraordinarily well. But against players that are just mediocre, which is probably what a lot of these guys are in this $200 game, you don't have to balance well. That being said, this is sort of like that earlier when you had the kings and you made it 50 instead of 40. Anything you do that's really weird the first time is probably going to work. And that includes like 3-betting, 4-betting, donks, donk leads, anything like that will probably work the first time. So this is a pretty good spot to go ahead and try it out one time. So a lot of these hands are just trading blinds. I would probably fold to 10-4. Calling here is fine. You'll flop pretty well. You donk again. I kind of like this a little bit less than I did the last time because he's going to give you less credit at this point. You turn a jack. If I checked here and he bet, like say he bets 180, I would go ahead and shove on him. I think you have enough equity to justify it. 9 on the river is probably good. I don't really think you should go for value though because the flush draw got there and your opponent could easily have you beat even at this point. So I would check and probably call, but I would be unhappy about calling. And as you see, he didn't really give you any credit for the donk that time. With 7-2 suited, I think raising's okay. I guess I'm not really opposed to raising suited cards, even if they are really bad. But I would still fold this probably. So like really bad suited cards I would fold. Hands like Jack 4 I would probably fold. Your opponent's playing back at you some, so it's not like he's just letting you run him over. So I'm not really too sure you can justify raising everything. I like the shove here. Your opponent's getting really short now, so we're just going to pound away on him. When your opponent gets short and he is shoving a decent amount of the time, you can fold your worst hands. Like 5-4 you just folded, I think that's a good fold. Ooh, I don't know why you do this. I would say this is definitely a leak to call here with the Jack 2 suited. And I would definitely check shove the flop. Anytime you get a piece of the board and your opponent's this short, you're usually best off check shoving to try to force him off hands that have a lot of equity. And even if he has like ace king, you want him to fold here. So I would check shove. I would never check call here. I think that's definitely a leak as well. And like this is a pretty cool spot. I'm not too sure if the bluff would have worked here. Obviously, when you check shove the Jack 2 suited, you are going to try to bluff him off of some hands. It probably wouldn't have worked. But notice even when you are bluffing, you have plenty of equity. So I would have went for it there. But I would have just folded pre-flop for sure. I have no clue why you didn't fold pre-flop with the Jack 2 suited. So here you try the check raise again. I don't hate this check raise. I think it's okay, but I don't know. I think it's okay. You have to be careful with stuff like this whenever your opponent's really short, though, because anytime it fails, you just lose so much of your stack. And it's not that you're losing part of your stack, but you're giving it to their stack. So anytime this guy goes from, like say he had 800 to start, if he goes to 1,000, that's a pretty big jump. And you don't really want to give him those opportunities. So I tend to not make too many moves when my opponent gets shorter, unless they're really good spots. And that certainly is an okay spot. I'm not going to say it's a bad spot, but given the stack size, I just would not have done that. Queen 3, I'd probably fold. Queen 4 earlier you had, I'd probably fold. It seems like you raise these every time, and I think it's okay, but I suggest you look at like your Hold'em manager or something and see if you're losing money with these hands, because I wouldn't be a bit surprised if you're losing money with hands like this. I would fold here for sure. This guy hasn't check raised you very much at all. I mean, he may be capable of making a play, and if he does, so be it. But he's shown no propensity to make plays at you. So when he does check raise, I would just fold there every time. So it seems like you do have some plays in your game. Just make sure that your bluffs look exactly like your value hands. Like on that Queen 6-6 board, I'm not sure if you're ever check raising a queen or a 6 there. And if that's the case, your opponents can destroy you if they figure out what you're doing. Right here, I'd probably find a call 7-8 suited. This hand flops extraordinarily well. Not a good flop for you. He bets 123. Huh. I'd probably just fold, but if you see him do this often, you can consider jamming, because if he's doing this every time he 3-bets, then he probably is doing it with air. And if he's doing it with air, you can get him to fold. Obviously, we haven't seen him do anything like this so far, so we just need to get out of the way. But if you get to play with this guy ever again in the future, make sure you're taking notes on that kind of thing. 10-2, I would muck this every time. A lot of the time when your opponents recognize that you are raising a ton, like raising pre-flop a ton, they will start playing back at you. And this guy has adjusted pretty well to playing back at you. Started 3-betting you quite a bit. And because of that, an easy adjustment is just to fold a lot of your junk hands out of your range. So say you're raising like 90% of hands pre-flop, which seems to be about what you're doing. If you cut that down to like 70%, you're going to have a hand a lot more often when you raise pre-flop, and that's going to allow you to play back at him much more often, instead of just having to fold hands like 10-2 and Jack-4. Say you 3-bet again, obviously you call off with the 9s. Okay, so you limp for the first time with Jack-2. I'm not too sure what the purpose of this is. I would probably just fold. I have seen a lot of players, whenever the stacks get a little bit shallower, they start limping occasionally. But I think you're probably best just continuing to be aggressive and just folding the worst hands in your range. I think that's probably a better play than limping with your garbage hands. Obviously, if you limp, you need a limp bet, of course, which you do. So that's good. Another thing you can do if you limp and your opponent starts shoving on you for a lot, like this guy is, you can continue just to raise your medium hands, because your opponents are going to think that you're raising with good hands, and with your really good hands you can limp, because they will be prone to shoving. And even if they don't shove on you, they may think you have a very weak range. And if your opponents think you have a weak range, they may be prone to not fold whenever they get any piece of the flop. So like say you pick up aces and you limp, and your opponent does check and it comes 9-4-2, you should still bet, and your opponent could easily try to make a play at you with a 9. Or a 4 or a 2, or like ace-3 or something like that. So, anyways, if you're going to limp with garbage, you definitely need to limp with monsters as well. But against guys that are going to just jam over your limps, you do need to limp a few times to set them up for this, because it's a really powerful play if you get a monster and you can get your opponent just to rip it all in with air. Here you call a Queen 6 suited. It's okay. I'd probably fold. I would probably check shove. You seem to like this check call play out of position with middle pairs and bottom pairs, hands like that. I think you should probably take that out of your game. It's just very tough to play. For example, on any turn, this guy could easily bet and put you in just a miserable situation. Like right here, even if you're ahead, it's just not that good, because if you call, your opponent still has plenty of equity. And if you shove, your opponent can call pretty correctly against you. So this is just not a good spot you set yourself in. So you do call. Your opponent jams the river. So it seems like we've run into this spot twice in the last two games where you've made something like middle pair and let your opponent bluff off. But I think you've been lucky. Let's see if you call and win. You do call and win. I think you've been lucky in that your opponents are spazzing out on you. If this guy had something like king 9, you would just go broke. Or if he had ace king or king queen or king jack or king 10 or pocket 2s or pocket 9s, you just go broke. So even though you did win both these hands, you need to be careful in spots like this. And I do certainly understand that by check raising the flop, you do force your opponents off their air. Notice, though, that even jack 7 on this flop has a decent amount of equity. It's not like a disaster to force him off of this hand. So with strong made hands, like say you had ace 9, I'd be more prone to check call down. But with hands like queen 6, you're probably better off throwing out a bluff because your opponent's going to have a lot of equity in the hand no matter what he has, and it's never bad to get him off those hands. So that's going to wrap up this video. We'll be back with part 2, where we get to play us another player. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to let me know. This has been Jonathan Little for PokerStrategy.com. Thanks for watching.